My Govanin Melanin, and welcome back to Medieval Art. I'm Dr. Brian Keane, and our Fellowship of Curators has many thoughts about the season finale of The Rings of Power. One of the art historical references that kept occurring to me was the number of times we see people wearing rings, not just in this series, but throughout the history of art. I'm thinking of sacred figures, saints, figures from Christian history in the Middle Ages that we see, as well as bankers, merchants, cardinals, popes, and others. These rings, of course, would be set with jewels made of precious materials, all of which would have very important, powerful symbolism and materials themselves behind them. So, John, what were some of your thoughts in thinking about the materials of the rings as we saw in this finale episode?
It was a really interesting connection for me in doing some work that I've been looking at lately on sort of medieval nature encyclopedia, these compilations of information from the natural world, the properties of stones and metals, what they're used for. And there are some really beautiful early printed examples from Germany in the 1470s and 1480s. And I was struck by one edition in particular that for the section on the properties of stones, is depicted with an image of a saint covered in sort of a bejeweled mitre and crozier and cope, really showing how these elements of the natural world, beautiful gemstones, carry certain virtues and properties that reflect the saintliness or virtue of the wearer. And so it's an interesting idea about the natural world produces these elements that have very specific properties. And I know, Sophia, you were also looking at sort of the material world and the ores and gems that were produced in medieval Europe.
Yes, thank you. In fact, I am so glad we finally got to the forging of the rings, the titular title here. So I was looking at really the process of how the rings were forged. It reminds me of the smelting process that happened even like back in the 16th century, whereby you have to separate the metals themselves from the ores. So in terms of smelting, it is using heat and chemical reactions to separate the metal from the ore itself. So for example, the elves would have had to do this with the mithril before they added the gold and the silver to it. And I am reminded of Georg Agricola's treatise from 1556, De Re Metallica, which has over 290 woodcuts. This treatise is all about like mining and metallurgy. And there's a particular woodcut print of the furnace where smoke is blowing out of it. So for the elven smith, it's definitely a more Art Deco type of furnace that they've produced. And Diva, I think you have more thoughts around the rings and the power that they symbolize.
Yeah, thanks, Sophia. And yeah, it's really interesting to hear everyone's thoughts about sort of different connotations and symbolic powers that rings have taken on in Europe and medieval Europe. And I think one thing that I was thinking about is how the idea behind the forging of the rings and the rings of power is really about imbuing a physical object with magical powers, literally. And we've really seen that throughout the history of art, whether it's relics in the Catholic tradition or in a variety of different contexts where relics, for example, were something that could literally heal people in medieval Europe. They were seen as also having this, just like a ring, kind of slippery, dangerous line where they could become too worshipped as a literal object, but they could also be quite healing and beneficial. So I was really thinking about the power of objects and kind of life-granting and healing as well as dangerous. Sarah, I know you also had some really interesting thoughts about another part of the episode with the palantir and the sketching.
Yeah, thanks, Diva. I similarly was thinking about the way that objects are imbued with power, particularly as it relates to death and commemoration. So particularly the scene of Eärien sketching Tar Palantir after he had passed away. And it got me thinking about deathbed portraits and also death masks, a tradition that goes back to antiquity. And that really got revived in the 19th century and a lot of times. So when a person would die, particularly a person who was famous, playwrights, writers, composers, artists, things like that, cast would be made of their face on their deathbed. And in the 19th century, you start seeing reproductions of those objects, and they could be used for as models, as we see in the episode, the idea of the portrait being a model for a future memorial to Tar Palantir. And it was really interesting and particularly playing off what Diva is saying about the kind of properties that become associated with things like relic and rings in this show, I think it's really interesting to see that commemoration through representation happening with Aarian's drawing, because as we know, the Numenorians, and particularly someone like Pharazôn, will become increasingly invested in, overcoming the short lifespan of humans, even the Numenorians who live much longer. And I'll throw it back to you, Brian.
Yeah, I think what we've all touched on, again, the power that objects have. And as art historians, that's something that we think about all the time. So I'm thrilled to continue to think about how each of the objects that we've mentioned will continue to have power in the seasons to come. When we watch the ring Vilya, which is beautiful sapphire representing air, that will be worn by Gil-galad. And then the ring Narya with its ruby that represents fire, that will be given to Círdan, a character we've not yet met, but that will ultimately pass to Gandalf, a character that we may have met in this series. And then Nenya, the ring with adamant, that is beautifully behind me there with its twisted band that I loved seeing in the episode, that represents water and that will be worn by Galadriel. It's been interesting to think, as well as we've watched the series, about the number of callbacks to art history, to Peter Jackson's trilogies, the role that music has played as well in the series. And so I'm curious, in our final moments, if we could each quickly go around and say one thing that we're really looking forward to in our second season. And John, I'll bounce it over to you.
I am really looking forward to seeing a little bit more of the grandiose, like the epic story. We've seen a lot of sort of interior spaces, and as much as we've seen like Middle-earth writ large, there are some of those, the epic journey across the landscape is another aspect that I would like to see more of.
And Diva.
The risk of sounding morbid, I'm actually looking forward to seeing the rise of Sauron. Like, I'm kind of become a big, I really not, it sounds terrible to say, but I've kind of enjoyed him being humanized in a way, or we've only seen him in the Peter Jackson films as this big guy in armor that's really not humanized in any way, and then he becomes just an eye, right? So I'm really interested in seeing the construction of Mordor, and to use our tagline from last week, the architecture of evil, and how that sort of place gets built.
And hopefully we see a shape-shifting Sauron or other guises would be wonderful. What about Sophia?
I would echo the whole Sauron, Adar kind of impending battle, I would assume. But on top of that, I would say also the trying to understand like how Khazad-dûm went from this amazing, amazing environment of like these labyrinths and such that is so productive, to what we had seen in the Peter Jackson series.
And Sarah.
I also am excited to see the continuation of the Sauron-Adar relationship. And, it seems interesting to me, it feels, and even Halbrand and Galadriel's confrontation in the last episode feels very Shakespearean, which actually isn't Tolkienian in some ways, but it kind of points to how I think the show might go off in its own directions in ways that I'm excited to see develop in the next season. How about you, Brian?
All of the above. I think I'm excited to eventually see the downfall of Numenor. We need the forging of the other rings, the 7 for the dwarf lords, the 9 for the rings, the race of men. I'd like to see other dwarf kingdoms, to see other kingdoms of men as we move forward. And then, of course, I'd love for Elrond and Galadriel to go off and found their own realms of Imladris and of Lorien. Those are the sites that I'm also dying to see as we move forward. Well, this has been a great series of conversations. We'll certainly continue with this discussion as we think about the Rings of Power moving forward. Thank you all again. Namaste.